President Trump has ordered the Pentagon to pull all U.S. troops out of Syria. Earlier, he tweeted, quote, "We have defeated ISIS in Syria. My only reason for being there during the Trump presidency."
The White House has asked the Pentagon to start planning the immediate withdrawal of American forces from the region. This includes 2,000 U.S. soldiers. So CBS News national security correspondent David Martin is joining us now from the Pentagon. So this is just sort of breaking today, David. What is the latest on this? What are you hearing from your sources there?
Well, the decision to pull all U.S. troops out of Syria was made yesterday and given to the military to start executing overnight. And, of course, it will take them some time to come up with a plan and then execute a withdrawal. But there are not a lot of forces in there, 2,000, so it shouldn't take too long. Now, the president's tweet said, "We have defeated ISIS in Syria." I'm not sure everybody in the Pentagon would agree with that. I'm sure the military would not agree with that. For one thing, although the U.S. with its allies in Syria, the Syrian Democratic Forces, have taken back virtually all of the land that ISIS seized in Syria at the end of the Obama administration. There are still a few pockets of ISIS holdouts along the Euphrates River Valley down close to the border with Iraq. So the remnants of the caliphate that President Trump had vowed to annihilate still exist. But more importantly, the Pentagon has talked for over a year now of achieving the quote-unquote lasting defeat of ISIS. And that means not only taking back all of the territory that ISIS seized, but also creating conditions in Syria which would not permit them to reemerge after U.S. troops left. And that principally consisted of training between 40 and 50,000 local security forces who would then govern these areas that had been liberated from ISIS, but which were badly destroyed in the fighting and in need of vast recovery efforts. Now, if that training effort is only about 20% complete, so the conditions for the lasting defeat of ISIS are still quite some way away. So I think some people will see this as snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, claiming victory prematurely. However, the other side of the argument is that Syria was becoming an increasingly complicated battlefield and was looking more and more like an open-ended U.S. military commitment. In fact, not too long ago, just within the past couple of weeks, the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, said U.S. troops will remain in Syria as long as there are Iranian-backed forces in Syria. That could last forever. And so the U.S. had seemed to be creeping into this open-ended role in Syria, which was becoming more complicated because now Turkey is talking about moving its troops into Syria to go after some of the same Kurdish forces that are being supported by U.S. troops. And so it was the specter of a clash between Turkish forces and U.S. forces, two NATO allies, was also starting to loom on the horizon. Syria is a mess. And it may be that President Trump simply decided that the only thing to do was to declare victory and get out. But I am sure that there will be many accusations that the U.S. has abandoned its Kurdish allies in Syria.
In fact, that's what's happening right now. You know, we've been watching sort of Twitter, and Lindsey Graham, who is at times a supporter of the president, is tweeting out, with all due respect, ISIS is not defeated in Syria, Iraq, and after just returning from visiting there, certainly not Afghanistan. However, withdrawal of our forces in Syria might mightily undercuts the effort and puts our allies, the Kurds, at risk. My question for you is, the president was really pushing for an immediate withdrawal, I think, in the spring. And it seemed like his advisors had convinced him to back away from that. What has changed since then?
Well, what's changed is there has been undeniable progress on the battlefield. They continue to chip away at these ISIS strongholds. There are just like 20 or 30 kilometers left of ISIS-held territory in the Euphrates River Valley in Syria, and they're chipping away at it at the rate of about a kilometer a day. So if you do the math, there's about a month or two left of fighting before the caliphate is eliminated, and then you get on to the other business of creating conditions so that ISIS could not return. But while that steady progress has been made, there are all these signs that this is becoming an open-ended mission. The statement by John Bolton that U.S. troops would remain there as long as Iranian-backed forces are there, statements that U.S. troops would remain there until there is a political settlement in Syria, which is nowhere on the horizon. The presence of U.S. troops there was going to continue to be a very, very complicated situation. And it just looks, I don't know President Trump's thinking, it looks like he decided, look, if we just declare victory and go home, we don't have to worry about, or at least we don't get caught up in all of these events that are still unfolding in Syria.
David, what about other forms of support? You talked about Iraq. There are troops in the region that could sort of spring into action at any point. There's missile strikes. Or are there other ways that the U.S. military could continue to support the Kurds without actually having troops on the ground?
Well, right now there are artillery batteries on the Iraqi side of the border shelling ISIS positions in Syria. That's how close to the Iraqi border this fighting is. So those artillery batteries aren't going to go away. And of course, the U.S. has been flying air strikes into Syria. However, those airstrikes and those artillery strikes are called in with the help of American Special Operations Forces, who have the technology, who have the intelligence to be able to pinpoint those strikes to make the danger of killing civilians at least as limited as possible. Now, if all of those troops are pulled out, the people who call in the airstrikes, then it's hard to see how the airstrikes can remain to be as effective. Now, there is also the possibility that you could pull out American troops and just use the CIA in an undeclared operation that supports the Syrian Democratic Forces. And I think these are matters that are all being discussed right now. This is a very new decision, and exactly how it's going to be implemented has not been worked out.
One last thing on one last tweet from Lindsey Graham, who moments ago wrote, "A decision to withdraw will also be viewed as a boost to ISIS' desire to come back." To your point about how few kilometers of territory they still hold, is that a realistic fear, or are we talking about remnants that do not raise to that level of concern?
No, it's a legitimate fear. I mean, for some time, ISIS has been switching to guerrilla warfare, where you melt into the population. You don't try to fight as an organized military force. So although there are these hardcore foreign fighters that are holding on to these strongholds, much of the ISIS manpower has already sort of melted into the Syrian countryside. Their leader, al-Baghdadi, is, as far as we know, still alive and perhaps able to rally them. So it looks very much like the situation that occurred when the U.S. pulled out of Iraq and left behind conditions which allowed ISIS to come flowing back both into Iraq and Syria. So nobody, at least in the military, would tell you that a lasting defeat of ISIS, A, has been accomplished, or B, is even imminent. There is a lot of work that the U.S. military sees has to be done before you can claim to have defeated ISIS.
Okay, and we've learned the announcement of a decision and the execution of that decision can be two different things in this White House. So a lot more details to follow through on. David Martin, thanks so much for reporting at the Pentagon.
Sure thing.